Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Against the Odds. So last week we had a second chance poll for Against the Odds with a bunch of options that had come in second or third in previous weeks, and in the end, it was Treefolk Tribal sneaking out a win by just a couple of percentage points over Rogue. So this week, we are heading to Modern to play some games with Treefolk, see if we can pick up some wins. A quick reminder before we break down Treefolk Tribal for Modern. If you want to vote for next week's deck, follow the link in the description. It'll take you to an article on the website. Down at the bottom, you'll find a poll. It's the read more link, by the way, but you'll find a poll. It will let you vote for next week's Against the Odds deck. Anyway, let's talk Treefolk Tribal, and we've talked about this a bunch of times before. When it comes to building tribal decks, I like to think about the competitive advantage. What does that tribe do better than anything else? And for Treefolk, it's pretty straightforward. There's not a ton of options. There's not a ton of tricks. Treefolk are just big. If you want to just play big, huge things and try to smash your opponent down, that's what Treefolks do. That's pretty much all that Treefolk do. There's not really any other way about it. So that's basically the plan of the deck. We are looking to play some really undercosted, really big Treefolk and just beat our opponent down, hopefully before they get a chance to kill us. So kind of the key card, or I guess the key tribal piece for Treefolk, is Timber Protector. This is the Treefolk Lord. It's a bit expensive. It's 5 mana, but you get a 4/6, which is actually pretty big, and it pumps all of our Treefolk, but also gives them indestructible, which means they're really hard to kill. Once we get a Timber Protector down, our Treefolk aren't only huge, but we can kind of just swing away freely because our opponent's not going to be able to kill them. It also makes our Forest indestructible, which is mostly a troll thing, but it's super sweet because opponents don't realize that. You don't think of a lord giving your lands indestructible. So I think we might get some free Ghost Quarter or Tech Edge value as people are like, we can destroy that, and then realize that Timber Protector is actually protecting our forests as well as our actual Treefolk. So Timber Protector's Lord number 1. Hopefully we can curve out with Treefolk, play Timber Protector, and then just beat down with all of our huge indestructible things. Our second Lord isn't actually a Lord, but when you think about how Treefolk are constructed, it really is, and that's Doran the Siege Tower. So Doran is awesome. It's legendary, which is a little disappointing, but it's a 5/5 essentially for just 3 mana, since it makes everything deal damage equal to its toughness. It has 5 toughness. The other thing is, this is basically a Treefolk Lord because a lot of our Treefolk have more toughness than they do power. So like take Timber Protector, it's a 4/6. If we play Doran, it's actually like a 6/6 for 5, which is definitely a lot better. So Doran is a Lord for a decent amount of our creatures. Also, even beyond the Lord potential, it's just a really big thing, and that's basically what Treefolk do. A 5/5 for 3 is pretty above the curve, even by modern standards, so very good card in that sense, being a Lord, being just a huge beater. We also have a single Metallic Mimic, kind of a pseudo-Lord. Treefolk do not have many Lords, so we have Metallic Mimic as a one-of. Kind of helps with curve purposes. A bit awkward because it's not a Treefolk in our deck, and we do have some Treefolk tutors, but it's a fine filler-type Lord for our deck. So these are the Lords. Pump up our creatures. The other thing is just huge creatures, and the best of these is Dauntless Dowerbark. Dauntless Dowerbark is just incredibly big. In our deck, which is all forests except for a single non-forest land, also all Treefolk as far as creatures. I think we have 27 Treefolk in our deck. Dauntless Dowerbark is very consistently a 7/7, an 8/8 for 4 mana that gets even bigger through the course of the game. Also has Trample. It is just, I mean, it might be the biggest 4-drop in Modern in a dedicated Treefolk deck. So this is our easiest way to just win games. If we can go Treefolk, 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 play a Dauntless Dowerbark, it's going to be like an 8/8 with Trample, just beat our opponent down. Maybe we have our Lord to make it indestructible. We also have Dungrove Elder, which isn't as big as Dauntless Dowerbark, but it is super hard to deal with. Like I said, we have a very forest-focused mana base. So Dungrove just gets bigger throughout the game. 4/4, 5/5, 6/6. With Hexproof, bigger than most most things on the board, can block well, can go attacking when the time calls for it. The other Treefolk in our deck are Treefolk Harbinger and Boss Banneret. So Treefolk Harbinger is our tutor Treefolk. 0/3 for 1 mana. When it enters the battlefield, we can search for a forest or a Treefolk, put it on top of our deck. So searching for a forest is sometimes relevant to make sure we hit our land drops to play our big Treefolk. Also just lets us tutor up our lords, tutor up our Doran, tutor up our Dower back if the situation calls for it. We even have some one-of Treefolk to tutor up in certain situations. Also works incredibly well with Doran, since it ends up being a 3/3 once we get a Doran down, and a 3/3 for 1 that also tutors up whatever Treefolk is best in our situation, or a land if we need it, is super strong. And then Boss Banneret's kind of the same way. It lets us play our Dauntless Dowerbark a turn early, our Lords a turn early. Also ends up being a 3/3 once we get down our Doran, so works really well there as well as a pretty aggressive 2-drop that also just makes our stuff super cheap. As far as our tutor targets, we mostly have 2 one-ofs in the main deck. One is Unstoppable Ash, which is a bit weird. It ends up being a 5/5 trample for 4, but it has to champion one of our Treefolk when it enters the battlefield. We exile it until Unstoppable Ash leaves the battlefield. Usually not a problem because we're very Treefolk focused. However, it also gives an ability where our creatures get blocked. They get +0/+5 until end of turn, which is a neat trick with one of our other cards that we'll talk about in a minute. Works really well with Trample. If our opponent blocks one of our Tramplers with a Doran, they get super huge, tramples over, kills our opponent. And then Sapling of Kolfinor is kind of our aggro hate card. It's indestructible, it can gain us some life. Pretty decent body, I guess. Not a great attacker, but the fact that it can gain us life, because a lot of our stuff has more toughness than power. Let's say we reveal a Treefolk Harbinger, we're gaining 3, reveal a Doran, we're gaining 5. Gives us a shot, a tutor target for aggro situations to hopefully gain a bit of life and stabilize while we look to take over the game. Then we have our utility cards, our non-Treefolk cards. Number 1 is Nylea, God of the Hunt, which is here primarily to give our creatures trample. We're not super devotion focused. We can turn on Nylea if we just Treefolk, have enough mana symbols, turn it into a creature. But for the most part, it's there to give our creatures trample, which works really well with like our Unstoppable Ash, works awesomely with just our huge stuff. Like Doran is so big, but if our opponent can chump block it with Lingering Souls, it gets a lot worse. So Nylea comes down, tramples up the team. Then we just have a bit of removal and discard for creature matchups, couple Fatal Push, couple Path to Exile for more combo-y, control-y matchups, couple Thoughtseize, couple Inquisition. So that's how we spent our utility slots in this deck. I think it's probably the best option as far as Treefolk are concerned. Gives us something to do on turn 1, can get blockers out of the way, maybe help us stay alive against combo and control decks. Mana base wise, Cavern of Souls is our only non-forest or non-fetch land, and our fetch lands always get forests. Gives us a little more oomph to fight against control decks by making our Treefolk uncounterable. 27 Treefolks, like I said, so it's making essentially all of our creatures uncounterable, which can be important in some matchups. Catacombs and Windswept Heath to search up our forests, and then forest-wise, Murmuring Bosk is super sweet. It's essentially an untapped tri-land as long as we have a Treefolk, which we always should have. It does ping us if we had white or black, but most of our cards are green anyway, so it's fine to just search up Murmuring Boss. If we need to Thoughtseize or Path, we can use it for black mana. Otherwise, we can just use it to cast our Treefolks without taking any damage. The full set of green, white, and black shock lands and the forest. So like I said, we have things that care about forests, want forests to matter. Dauntless Dowerbark primarily, so we want to make sure that we're supporting those cards as much as possible. Sideboard-wise, we get a few more Treefolk tutor targets. Heartwood Storyteller, really nice against control decks. It comes down if our opponent counters our spell, casts, say, Serum Visions, we get to draw a card. We don't have many non-creature spells in our deck, just the small numbers, so we kind of naturally just break the symmetry. Gives us a way to kind of fight through removal and counters and so forth. Wickerburrow Elder, tutor target for Affinity, for Tron even, blow up an Oblivion Stone, any artifact or enchantment. And then Lignify is a Treefolk removal spell. It's not a great removal spell, although it does get rid of all the creature's abilities, so it can be relevant there if our opponent has an Endbringer or something. But it's mostly in our sideboard because we can tutor it up with our Treefolk Harbinger, which gives us a tutorable kind of pacifism-esque effect. Then we have all the good white and black sideboard cards. Stony Silence for Affinity and Tron, Rest in Peace for Graveyard decks, Rule of Law for Storm, Fulminator Mage for Tron primarily, early. And then we have a bit more removal. Path to Exile and Other Thoughtseize, a Damnation as a sweeper, works really well with our Lord that gives our stuff indestructible. We can potentially get 2 of those down. Damnation kills our opponent's stuff, not our stuff. And then a Crossing Grip for more artifact and enchantment hate. And that is Treefolk Tribal for Modern. And that's our Against the Odds deck for this week. So we'll have to see. I'm a little nervous with Treefolk because, like we talked about in the intro, the competitive advantage of Treefolk is they're really big. Like, we just have things that are way above the curve at 3 mana, at 4 mana, at 5 mana. So that's what Treefolk do well. The question is, can we live long enough for those things to matter? Like, Dauntless Stourbark being an 8/8 or a 10/10 on turn 5 is awesome, but if we get stormed out on turn 3 or turn 4, being an 8/8 or a 10/10 for 4, like, sure, that's huge, but we're dead, so it doesn't really matter. So I feel like we should have a good shot in creature-y matchups, like, because our stuff is just bigger than our opponent's stuff. If our opponent's playing Death and Taxes or even playing Eldrazi, our stuff's going to be bigger a lot of the time. Then I think we have a pretty good shot. We got a bit of removal, a bit of discard, in just massive, massive creatures. On the other hand, against Ad Nauseam, against decks like Storm, I'm a little nervous because there's a decent chance they kill us before our bigness really matters. So we'll have to see how the matchups break down. Regardless, we should be able to deal a ton of damage over the mid game because our stuff is just super, super huge. So it should be fun either way. Anyway, that's our Against the Odds deck for this week. Treefolk Tribal for Modern. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.